Hey guys, in this video I will be using one of these Tamboti slabs and turning it into a side table. I started off by surfacing the slab. This wasn't necessary, but I had just made this surfacing contraption, and so I needed to test it out and see if it worked properly. And I haven't used Tamboti before, so I really wanted to see what it looked like after it had been surfaced. Obviously, you can't really see the grain much when it's still rough. So now that I've finished surfacing it, you could see the grain a little bit better, and it looked pretty cool. I was quite happy about it. So now that that was done, it was time to seal around the slab and get it ready for an epoxy pour. I only had glue for cornices available, and so I decided to give that a try. Definitely wasn't the best thing to use. It was a nightmare to remove it when I was done pouring the epoxy, but it did surprisingly well at sealing the slab. And as you'll see later in the video, I didn't have too many leaks. So that chirping sound in the background is the sound of my kids' voices sped up, and funny enough, that's sometimes how it sounds like in my head. So then it was time for the epoxy, which I was pretty worried about this. I was sure I was gonna have a lot of leaks, and the problem with epoxy is that if you have a little leak, it takes so long to cure that it'll leak all out. And so because of that, I started with just a small amount of epoxy so that I didn't waste a whole bunch of it, and just to make sure I didn't have too many leaks. So the epoxy I'm using is from a place just up the road called AMT Composites. It is supposed to be able to be poured up to 50 millimeters or 2 inches in one pour. And as you can see, I did have a couple leaks, which I was able to put some of the cornice glue on, and it worked surprisingly well. Even though it was wet, it sealed up those leaks pretty quickly. Then I just used the last little bits of epoxy just to fill in all the little cracks that were throughout the slab. And so I came back the next morning, and there had been a couple leaks throughout the night. A little bit leaked onto the floor, but surprisingly not too bad. And by this stage, the epoxy had cured just enough so it wasn't going to continue leaking, and so it was safe to continue pouring. I did cover up a few spots where I thought it might continue to leak, and I poured some more, not too much. I still wanted to be safe. And then I came back a few days later and prepared the rest. As you can see, I don't have a nice blowtorch to get rid of the bubbles. I just used a little fire lighter, and it worked pretty well. So then we're back to the surfacing device. This was a bit of a nightmare. Epoxy's really hard, and it blunted my bit pretty fast. And so I didn't realize until closer to the end that my bit was very blunt, and that's why it was such a pain in the butt. I also hadn't poured quite enough epoxy, so I had to surface the slab quite deep to get to the level of the epoxy. So after becoming very frustrated with my surfacing, I ended up coming back the next day with a sharper bit, and it went pretty smoothly from there. So then it was time to start sanding down the slab. This I was very excited about. I really wanted to see what that grain was going to look like, and the epoxy ended up quite a lot easier than I expected to sand. It didn't even clog up the belt at all, which I was definitely expecting it to do that, but this process actually ended up being really nice and easy and quite fun. So with the sides of the slab, I decided to use just a wire brush to get rid of all the loose bits and dirt, and then I used some water-based Woodok 25 floor varnish, which I've found to dry very hard, which will help with the sides since there's thin spots, and it'll just harden those up so that if somebody hits it with something, it's not going to dent it or chip them off or ruin it. And because it's water-based, it doesn't really change the color much from the natural color, which I like. And obviously it looks a little bit blue here, but as soon as it dries really nice and clear. It's also a matte finish, which I didn't want any glossy finish on this. I definitely prefer matte. So then when it came to the top of the slab, I originally was going to use pure Rubio monocoat, and thankfully I put it on the bottom first and it looked terrible. And I'll show you the comparison later as soon as I'm done sealing the top. After I saw how terrible the Rubio monocoat looked, I decided to use the same Woodok 25 water-based, and brushing it on probably wasn't the best. It looked pretty horrible. Obviously you can't get rid of the brush lines. It doesn't settle by itself, and so I had to sand it down. I tried to just sand it so that it didn't go through to the wood, and just used 220 grit sandpaper, which the problem was that after sanding I had come through to the wood in a couple spots, as you can see, and so I then had to apply a second coat and then sanded it down again with the 220 grit. I still didn't like the way it looked, so I tried spraying it on with my spray gun, and that looked horrible. I think that the water-based is maybe a bit too thick, and so it looked like an orange peel. And so I sanded that down again, and still trying to sand it so that I didn't go through to the wood, again using the 220 grit sandpaper. And this time it worked out quite nicely. So then I just used some Scotch-Brite on the orbital sander to even out the finish so there weren't any glossy patches left. Then I went over it with some soft wax that I'd bought. It's Fired Earth soft wax, and this also is supposed to have a matte finish, and I figured this would work pretty well for just sealing it up properly and creating a somewhat glossy finish, which I think would look a lot better. So after applying the coat, I just used a clean cloth to buff it down. So here you can see where I put the Rubio monocoat on the bottom, and that's the water-based with the wax on the top. I really didn't like how the Rubio made the white areas so yellow. I think it looked pretty terrible. So then it was time to put the legs on. I had bought these hairpin legs from a hardware store called Gelmar. And so here's what it looks like. I'm very happy with how it turned out. Thank you all for watching. Please let me know what you thought, and if you liked my video, please consider subscribing. It would help me out a lot.